Okay, welcome to everyone who's coming in and who's just joined us. Welcome to this event on achieving equal pay in the education sector. The Equality Trust recently launched an equal pay toolkit, which was developed from a range of trade unions, academics, HR professionals and employees, and facilitated by the Equality Trust. At the Equality Trust, we recognise that social and economic inequalities are interrelated, and that pay discrimination not only affects individuals, but contributes to wider inequalities within society that affect everyone. If we can achieve equal pay for women, then the economy would benefit and we would see systemic transformational change for women and their households at a time when child poverty is set to rise. We also recognise that the intersectionality of different protected characteristics plays a huge part in how individuals and groups experience many of the issues that we're discussing today. We hope that you enjoy the event, learn from our distinguished speakers, and are inspired to access the toolkit and use it in your workplace afterwards. And I'll put a link to that in the chat. So my name is Sophi Berridge. I'm the Senior Campaigns Officer at the Equality Trust. I'm just going to go through some housekeeping first of all, but I'd just like to say that you're very welcome. So thank you very much for coming today. It is lovely to see you all joining. Please do use the chat to say hi, to say who you are and what organisation that you're from. We are recording this event so that people will be able to watch it afterwards and you'll be able to share it. Again, please use the chat function for comments or any tech issues if you can't hear anyone. And please do put questions in the chat for any of our speakers. I'm going to be taking questions at the end. I know this kind of goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. We hope that everyone will be respectful of one another and any kind of differing opinions. People are coming today to talk from kind of different angles about equal pay and the gender pay gap in the education sector. And I'm sure that everyone will kind of be polite and respectful of people's opinions. Please do use the hashtag equal pay toolkit or hashtag equal pay 50 on Twitter. And speakers, I will be watching you and keeping you to time. We hope there's going to be as few technical mishaps as possible, but please bear with us if there are any, and we will do our best to be able to give you a good event today. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our first speaker. I'd like to introduce you to Vivienne Porritt. She's the co-founder and strategic leader of Women Ed, which is a global grassroots movement that gives women leaders a voice in education. Vivienne, thank you so much for coming, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I'm delighted to join you this evening. Within the Women Ed community, the gender pay gap is my university challenge specialist subject. So I'm delighted to be able to open this event and looking forward to hearing from the rest of the speakers. I was a teacher and a head teacher in education, and I worked for a university also. And when I first joined the education profession, specifically the teaching profession, one of the reasons I did that was because it seemed a very equitable profession. It was about progress, social mobility, fairness and justice, until the awful moment when I discovered whilst I was just after I was a head teacher, that actually there was a gender pay gap in education. And that astounded me. And I just didn't understand how it could possibly be in the profession that's supposed to lead the way in justice and fairness. And so I've become obsessed with it in many ways, and particularly obsessed in ensuring that women in education know there's a gender pay gap and what we can do about it. I was delighted to work in partnership with NAHT and Natalie and the National Governance Association and ASCL also, to put together the most up-to-date review and analysis of the gender pay gap, which we published in November 21. And I know Natalie's going to take us through that. What I was surprised to discover while we were writing it, that out of all sectors, such as manufacturing, such as finance, such as mining, education in 2021 had the highest gender pay gap of all, or the worst gender pay gap is what I prefer to call it. How can education have a bigger gender pay gap than mining and construction? It's shocking. And the more we know about it, the more we all want to do something about it. One of the key headline figures that I know Natalie will explore in more depth is that head teachers who are over 60 in the teaching profession, there is a gender pay gap of over £17,000 a year. And of course, for heads over 60, that's also going to lead to a pension pay gap. Women are 3/4 of the whole education industry. And it's time now for us to tackle this and begin changing it. And it's the leadership posts and the leadership salaries that are driving that gender pay gap. So as part of Women Ed and representing Women Ed, I just want to call on all women in education to read all of the reports, to use the toolkit that's going to be linked throughout this, because that helps us talk about pay. It helps us to learn how to do equal pay audits. And most of all, it helps us build a culture of equity. And I want to just say 3 very simple actions that we can all do to make a difference to the gender pay gap for women. Number 1, every organisation to remove the current salary question from their application forms and to remove the question from any references. I don't know why it's there. It bears no reason. Nobody's trying to employ the cheapest person. So let's get rid of it, because that will help women. Also, secondly, explore your own school's gender pay gap. It's eye-watering in some examples. And if your school didn't have to do a gender pay gap, then ask them to do one and have that conversation in your organisation. And finally, every individual woman, practice negotiating. It's really not as scary as we think it is. And once we start doing it, it's compulsive. So I really want to hear on Twitter that people are going to take notice of those 3 actions. And let's take charge of making the change to the gender pay gap quicker than the system is going to enable it. Have a fabulous, fabulous conversation this evening, and thank you for inviting me to join you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Vivienne. That was wonderful. Thank you.
My pleasure.
It's really appreciated. I'm going to pass on to Natalie, if that's okay. So Natalie Arnett is the Senior Equalities Officer at the NAHT, the National Association of Head Teachers. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about the equality of pay in leadership and achieving equal pay and parity for women. And then I'm going to ask Natalie, because Kate's with you today, I'm going to ask you to pass on to Kate. So Kate's also from the NAHT, and she's the head of advice, and she's going to be talking about this as well. Thank you so much, Natalie. I'll pass on to you.
Thanks so much, Sophie, and good evening, everyone. As Sophie said, Kate and I are going to be doing a bit of a double act today from NAHT, but I'll just kick off. So for those of you who might not be aware of NAHT, we are the largest school leadership union, and we represent more than 34,000 serving school leaders across England, Wales, Northern Ireland and the Crown Dependencies. And we've got members from ranging from CEOs and heads through to deputy assistant heads and school business leaders, as well as middle leaders as well. And something that I think Kate will probably pick up on in her section, but it is worth kind of mentioning up front, is the fact that as school leaders, our members hold quite unique positions. And when we consider our work around equal pay and the gender pay gap, we think about it from kind of 2 positions. One, supporting them as individuals, but also supporting them as leaders in their own schools and recognising the influence and responsibilities that they have and how we can support and empower them to discharge these effectively. I just wanted to quickly run through, before I share a short slide with you for some of that research that Vivienne just touched on, about kind of equal pay versus the gender pay gap. And so while we've got equal pay and the gender pay gap, we know they are interlinked, and it is really helpful to be considering them together, which is why I wanted to bring the presentation today. They are separate, and there are different but interrelated solutions and causes. And so equal pay refers to the legal requirements that are within an organisation. So male and female staff members who are engaged in equal or similar work or work of equal value must receive equal pay and other benefits. However, the gender pay gap is a broader concept and measures the difference in the average earnings of men and women, regardless of the nature of their work across an organisation or a sector or even an entire industry. And for those organisations with over 250 or more employees, they now have a legal obligation to publish their gender pay gap information. Having a gender pay gap in and of itself isn't illegal, nor does it necessarily mean that an employer would have breached the equal pay provisions. However, it can indicate that there are broader equality issues that need to be addressed. So I think having an understanding of the gender pay gap, as Vivienne's touched on, is actually really helpful for opening up some of those conversations, which leads me neatly into the report that we released along with ASCL, NGA and Women's Ed at the end of last year, which was trying to look at the gender pay gap within education. And part of that was to begin having a bit of a debate and discussion around what the picture looked like in education. Yeah, so as I said, it came out at the end of last year, and it was really to explore what does the gender pay gap look like in education in 2020, and use the school workforce census to compare not just in 2020 using the 2020 data, but actually what did it look like over the last 10 years. We know in education that there is a broad national pay framework that many schools either are legally required to use or use as a benchmark and framework, which is the STPCD. Yet despite this, we can see that regardless of school phase or structure, men typically are earning more than women. And the more senior their position, the wider the gulf appears to become. So in 2020, at classroom teacher level, the gap was just above 2% on average, but we're looking at over 11% on average for those at head teacher level. And as Vivienne touched on earlier, this difference intersects with age and role. So the more senior, the wider the gulf becomes. And the really shocking figure that we found out was the difference by age 60 and over reaches £17,334. So we're not talking small amounts here. And again, as Vivienne mentioned, this implication has implications not just for pay, but for also for the pension pay gap, for the pension gap as well. I think these are really quite stark. You can see the gap really clearly here in average head teacher pay by age in all state funded schools. And I think it's just a really good example of what it looks like in reality. And that's the same actually at other leadership levels as well. So although the difference isn't quite as large, for those who are termed other leadership, and here we're talking about deputy and assistant heads, there is still a really big gap, and the divergence point seems to start to occur around 35 to 39 years old, and actually almost doubles between those, so from £2,760 at age 35 to 39 to £4,024 at age 40 to 44. So a really clear point where that gap and the impact of kind of career and progression really starts to bite. And in the very limited number of cases where the average salary pay gap favoured women, the difference tended to be far smaller. So for example, in 2020-21, the largest gap in favour of women was just under £1,000, and that was for classroom teachers in primary academies. Yet the largest gap in favour of men was well over £4,000, and that was head teachers in special or Peru Academy. So we can see that, you know, the gap really is quite substantial. And as our So, you know, just having this research it is helpful, but really it's intended to inform the debate and highlight areas where action needs to be taken. And the report, which I will put a link into in the chat, really does set out a number of recommendations, not just for schools, but for government. And governors governing boards and schools and individuals as well. So really trying to look at it from the different levels. But how does this link to the toolkit and equal pay? And I think really going back to the point I made right at the start, that this really, and it's outlined in the toolkit itself, underlines the importance of needing to talk about pay and raising awareness of what it looks like in the sector and in individual schools. And I think really opening a debate on the way the pay system operates. And I think that goes back to the point about kind of looking at the support for our members at both an individual but also a leadership level as well. So I'm going to hand over to Kate now to talk about what we do and how the toolkit can be used for our members in their roles.
Thank you, Natalie. The first thing I'd actually like to touch on is the pension point that's already been mentioned. And I think it's really important because sometimes we need an impetus to begin these conversations because they're not always easy. Just to give you an idea about the damage this can do to salaries over the long run, it isn't just the money you get in your pocket as you're working, it is potentially your retirement income. So just to give you an idea of the kind of figures you might be looking at, if you retired at age 60 in the final salary scheme, I know we've moved to career average now, but people will still have a large pot there, and your salary was 50,000 and you'd done 25 years in the scheme, you'd have an annual income of £15,625 from the teacher's pension scheme. If your income was 55,000 instead, so getting rid of some of that disparity in treatment, your income would be £18,125 instead. So £2,500 a year difference in terms of your ongoing pension income, just by a £5,000 lower salary than potentially you could achieve. When you look at that over the average lifespan of a member in the teacher's pension scheme, 23 years, that's £57,500 that you'd be missing out on because your pay stopped at 55 when perhaps some of your male colleagues got to 55,000. So I stopped at 50 and rather than got to 55,000. So this inequality gets baked in, and it gets baked in as you move through your career path, because if you start getting chipped away at, it's harder to move to your next step. And as Vivienne mentioned, if you move to a new job and you're asked to declare your salary, sometimes people think, oh good, we can get somebody in on a lower point on the scale, get them in, have it cheaper, but that entrenches that inequality for women in education. And it is that long-term impact, not only on your salary while you earn it as a worker, but when you retire, these numbers, sometimes small, sometimes extraordinarily large, as Natalie pointed out, when you get to age 60, they are really, really big and they're really meaningful. And you are doing the same work as the people who are earning more on our survey. You are not doing a different job. So talking about these things is the starting point, not being afraid to talk about it and understanding that it really matters. These aren't small sums, either in terms of what you're earning at the moment or looking after your long-term future. It is something that should be open, transparent, and discussed. So if all today gives you is the confidence to open these discussions up, to talk with your colleagues, talk with your employer, speak to your trade union and have these discussions to begin to explore what can be done about this, for example, an equality audit, that would be a really good outcome, because if we don't talk about it and begin to unpick these things, these structures will just continue to affect and erode the pay that women in education achieve. And as colleagues said at the beginning, this becomes even more pernicious if you have any of those intersectional characteristics. If you're disabled, if you're not white, if you're gay, these things compound and compound. So open and transparent conversations are the way to begin the process. Because if everything is transparent, you can begin to have accountability. These figures and this lack of equality in terms of earnings are often in the shadows. And we think in education it's not an issue because there's a national framework and a national pay structure. So we sometimes have false confidence that this isn't an issue that affects the sector. In fact, it's quite the opposite. A lot of these discrepancies are based on times when you get some discretion in the system, so manager discretion about how you award pay within a range, or whether you give somebody a TLR for extra responsibility, or what level of TLR it is, and all those points and decisions making, we're seeing decision making points, we're seeing that women are falling behind men. And if we don't have these conversations and be brave and speak to your trade union and have those conversations, so you're not doing it alone, it will just become entrenched and will never be fixed. So that was one thing I wanted to mention, just to give you the confidence in terms of it being a real problem, and it not just being about your pay in your pocket, but about your pension as well, to have those conversations and begin to open it up. From an NAHT perspective, we will be encouraging our members who are school leaders to open these conversations with their employers to see, can we open the lid on the can of worms sometimes and have a look at how we have our salaries in our school. What are we doing? Are we doing it in the right way? Should we have the audit and start looking at it? Are we being transparent, and are we taking the right approach when we interview and select candidates? That we start with an issue there. And are we treating people fairly and equitably when we make those decisions, when we have discretion about what level of pay is awarded, or when someone gets a TLR, and all those sorts of things. So there is a leadership element as well, we believe, in terms of NAHT members, and to make sure that this is not something which exists within their school wherever possible. That's a bit of a whistle stop, so I'll hand back over to you, Sophie. But I suppose the key point is, if you don't have those conversations and don't begin to unpick this, a lot of it is quite hidden, and we think it's okay. And actually, often, as the survey showed, it really isn't.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you so much, Natalie. That's really good. We actually have 5 minutes in hand, and I saw some questions in the chat. So I'm actually going to go off script a little bit and just ask, because you were particularly focusing on leadership. There was a question in the chat that said, what about other intersectional lens other than age? And I wonder if either Kate or Natalie could kind of come in on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that. Absolutely. The more protected characteristics you have, as a general rule of thumb, the worse your pay will be in comparison to others. So it's an absolutely valid question, and something which needs to be looked at. The legislation and the firm pathway to achieving equal pay in terms of the two genders is a little bit clearer, and there are formal structures and frameworks, particularly for trade unions, to use in terms of collective bargaining to address the issue in terms of the comparison between men and women in equal pay. This has gone back about 50 years in terms of legislation, and incremental changes have come in, and case laws developed and frameworks have developed about how we do it. So in a way, it's an easy win, but it's very much an entry level win. There are absolutely other things which do make a very big difference to your pay. I don't know if that answers the question, Juliana, but please do pop another one in there if you want any more clarity. Sorry, I think your hand's got up.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, in terms of the analysis that we undertook, that was based on the school workforce census. So we could only compare on what was available, and there wasn't enough information other than age to be able to do that analysis all the way back over the last 10 years. And if you look in the report, there is a section that talks about intersectionality and says actually part of it is we need to improve the data at national level in order that we can have these wider conversations of not just in terms of gender and age, because that's all we can use at the moment to kind of robustly do this analysis.
Yes, thank you. I do know that the kind of collection of data is really key, and it's very difficult for us to kind of comment on things that we just don't have the data or the evidence to be able to comment on, even though we know anecdotally that these things are very important. Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to see if there are any more questions in the chat for Natalie or Kate. I don't think so at the moment. So I'm going to move on, if I may, to Claire. So I'd like to introduce Claire. She's Claire Ward is the National Executive Member and Chair of the NASUWT National Equal Opportunities Committee. And she's going to talk to us now. Claire, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sophie, and it's lovely to see so many of you here today. And for those of you who don't know, NASUWT is the largest teachers only union, which covers representation right from the very first initial teacher training and ECTs all the way through to our head teacher and principal, those leadership posts. So apart from that, the W actually stands for women. So I think we've got a vested interest in making sure that we get this right as trade unions, and, you know, making sure that our voices are heard. I've got a short PowerPoint presentation for you, which I'm going to share. Lovely. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you for just a little while about challenging the gender pay gap in schools and in colleges, and the work that the NASUWT does in order to try and address the situations that we've got here. So challenging the gender pay gap, then, we got the Equal Pay Act in 1970, and it is just as important now, 52 years later, to be challenging that as when the Equal Pay Act first became law. It'd be fantastic to think that we didn't have to do, but sadly that's not the way it is. You know, we've just heard from our other speakers, from the other colleagues, to say that it really hasn't changed, and in education that is very sad. In 2020, on the 50th anniversary of the Equal Pay Act, the TUC announced that the average woman effectively works for free for 2 months of the year compared to the average man. But in education, that estimate is even worse. The gender pay gap is about 25.4% in education. So the average woman effectively works for free for more than a quarter of the year, 93 days, and has got to wait until April comes around before she starts getting paid, compared to the average man. So it's never been more important to challenge this disparity within the education centre. Okay, moving on. The toolkit obviously tells us that unequal pay is a reality of working life. So at NAWT, we thought we'd share some of the data to show you what it actually reveals. Now, according to the queries that come into our member support advice team, over the last 12 months, and we do need to bear in mind that a lot of those cases are going to go straight to our caseworkers and our regional and national centres, but 4% of the enquiries came from members aged between 20 and 30, and 23% between 30 and 31. Within those two age brackets, actually some of those claims came from male members too. It could be for a number of reasons. The fact that those younger age groups are more aware of the law and aware of pay claims, and the fact that they're just not happy anymore, wanting to accept the fact that any disparity in pay could be an issue, and they're becoming more confident and more feeling that they can assert themselves better. But by far the biggest number of equal pay inquiries came from women between 41 and 50, and that was 50% of those inquiries, which could be down to a lot of kind of connecting issues, I suppose. You know, at that age, between 41 and 50, women are getting more confident, they're accessing management positions, they're being promoted, and probably experiencing direct discrimination. I know before we started on the webinar today, we were talking about disparities over maternity leave and people not actually receiving their pay increments because they've been on maternity leave. Now, if that's not a form of direct discrimination, I don't know what is. And also, you've got between the age of 41 and 50, you know, people need the money. They've got mortgages to pay, they've got childcare, cost of living nowadays. I mean, we can all see what's happening there. But they're probably going to be in more senior positions, and they're concerned about damaging their careers if they don't, I suppose, damaging their pensions if they don't challenge this at a more a higher level. Now, 77% of the claims that came into the NASUWT are being dealt with or have been dealt with by our legal team, and 23% dealt with locally by our lay caseworkers. So when we have people ringing into our member support advice team around gender pay gap, we are picking up every one of them to make sure that these disparities are kind of ironed out, and to make sure that our female members are being paid in line with their male colleagues who are doing the same job. So what else have we do we see really? Well, where are the inquiries coming from? Well, 26% of the inquiries come from community schools. So that means those schools that are still under local authority control. 21% came from the independent sector, 16% from FE colleges, and the largest number came from academies, and at 32%. Now, whilst it's slightly higher for academies, it had appeared that securing equal pay is an issue across education, regardless of employer. So again, despite the Equal Pay Act coming in 50 years ago, this toolkit that we've got really couldn't have come at a better time, especially when we're thinking about representations that we're making to the school teacher review body around pay, around the increments which teachers should be receiving, in order to reinstate to some degree the levels of pay that we were on 12 years ago. I mean, teachers in comparison with 12 years ago are between 19 and 23% worse off in real terms than when this government came in. So that in itself is going to be having an impact on our women members, and it has to be addressed at this time of year when we're waiting for the representations from the STRB. We do need to be focusing on the fragmented system. We need to be making sure that regardless of the employer, any pay claim is being addressed. And the toolkit is a really robust and positive tool to enable our negotiators to enter into those conversations with employers. Now, we don't expect our workplace reps to do that, but what the toolkit can be used for is for those workplace reps to begin those conversations with their colleagues within their unions in their workplaces. And once that knowledge is out there, and once the information is received from the membership to the workplace reps, that can then be passed up our chains locally in order for those people who have the remit, if you like, to negotiate, to begin having those, exploring it much further. So for us in NASUWT, the toolkit is going to be used on a lot of different levels, I suppose. You know, with the workplace reps, having those conversations with the members, but also with our negotiators being able to have that conversation on a wider level, maybe across districts, maybe across branches. And it's, you know, it is something that we're going to have to promote, and we're going to be quite forceful in promoting in order to make sure that these disparities are, wherever possible, ironed out. I did have a case study for you. What I'm not going to do is sit here and read you a screen, because there'd be no point. I think the important thing to know is that within the NASUWT, we're going to be using the toolkit on many, many different levels. We're going to be supporting our members with it and promoting it, because, you know, it's a really important piece of work, and it's just the start of that journey into trying to get things right. And using the toolkit around equal pay, gender-based equal pay, is going to be it's going to help us use it when we're looking at ethnicity-related pay gaps, etc., 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 which NASUWT are already doing a lot of work on as well. So I've probably waffled on for way too long, but there you have it.
You haven't waffled on at all, Claire. Thank you. It's lovely to hear from you. And I'm really pleased to hear you say that, yes, this is just the start. You know, we recognize that, you know, the toolkit is good, but it's quite narrow in focus. It's supposed to be the start of the conversation. And Juliana makes a good point in the chat about, you know, the tendency to use the data that's derived from gender to look at race, when the gap between white women and black women is huge. And we need to kind of bear that in mind kind of as we take this forward. So thank you very much for kind of raising that. Does anybody else have any any questions that they would like to ask Claire now? Because I've got a couple of minutes in hand, and if you've been inspired to think of something that you want to say, either you can put your hand up or put it in the chat. If not, I'll come to you at the end. Okay, that's fine. No worries. You'll probably get a got later after everybody's finished, Claire. So thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay, I'm going to introduce our final speaker now. So this is Jo Edge. She's the UCU NEC Women's Rep for Higher Education, a member for the Women's Members Standing Committee, and the incoming chair of UCU's Equality Committee. In her bio, so she's also disabled, has OCD, and is neurodivergent. She's a historian at the University of Edinburgh on a fixed-term contract. And Jo, it's lovely to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thanks to everyone else who's already spoken before me. It feels like a tough act to follow. So yeah, as Sophie said, I'm not only female, I'm also casualised in terms of my work at the University of Edinburgh. I'm also disabled, and I think those things are all really pertinent here. So UCU, the University and College Union, of which I'm a member, we represent education professionals across higher education, further education, and that includes prison education, adult continuing education. So it's a very broad sector with a set of different employers. You've got private employers, you've got local authorities, you've got universities. So we're dealing with a very diverse sector. And I don't know if anyone remembers that recently we've been on strike. We've had 18 days of strike action. One of those things was over pensions, but the other kind of strand of our strike action was about the 4 fights. And those 4 fights are casualisation, pay, workload, and the gender, race and disability gap. So all of these things are inextricably linked in ways that are really important. So this is a really key, this pay gap is a really key thing. Now, I think as everyone has already said, obviously this toolkit, which is great, has been developed around the gender pay gap specifically. Really nice to see a note there about trans inclusion and kind of some of the kind of issues that need to be addressed there. But also, I think the great thing about this is that it's done a lot of groundwork for some of those other inequality strands that also need huge work on in terms of race, disability, sexual orientation, etc. So I'm just going to take you through the situation in HE first. So in HE, UCU represents academic staff, so that could be lecturers, researchers, as well as higher grade professional services staff. Now, the data shows us, right, that in HE, the gender pay gap is 16%, the race pay gap is 17%, and the disability gap is 9%. Obviously, though, as has been mentioned already, the intersectionality here means that, it's not like there aren't, Black women, for example, are going to be vastly disadvantaged. The issue that we're finding with this gender pay gap in HE, though, is not really that women are generally being paid less to do the same job as men. I think that's something that we've seen in other speeches today. What we see on academic pay scales is that generally women and men are paid about the same to kind of work in roles up to a certain level. And then what we see is that in the professoriate and much higher sort of grades, this is dominated by men. So professors are obviously paid a lot more than other, academics on lower grades. And so this obviously skews that pay gap really hugely. The issue, it's complex, but the issue here is that women aren't being promoted into professorships at the same rate as their male peers. Now, anecdotal evidence. I'm a medieval historian. I work in what is traditionally quite a conservative field, quite a white field, quite a nepotistic field, if I'm honest, that's dominated by Oxford, Cambridge, and to an extent Durham. But, there is quite a lot of inequality in my field already. I've seen brilliant women who've gone above and beyond research grants, amazing kind of, done amazing things, finding it so much harder to get promoted. And then there seems to be mediocre men, or not mediocre, but men who've done a lot less, kind of shooed into professorship. And I think that's very telling. And I'm wondering, so I think this lack of being promoted within an academic role is quite key, really, in why we have a pay gap, at least in academic roles. So firstly, why is this? Firstly, there's an obvious point about caring responsibilities, not just children, but I think anecdotal evidence shows me that women tend to care more for elderly parents, etc. So obviously you have a lot less time on your hands to apply for promotions, produce world-leading research, obtain research grants. I think there's also a point here about headspace. It's very, very difficult to do this kind of high-level thinky work in the odd hour snatched between feeding your kids and putting them to bed, right? So that's a huge point. I think secondly, within academia and within academic roles, soft roles tend to fall disproportionately on women. We do the bulk of pastoral care, we do the bulk of admin, and the rest of the unglamorous stuff, either because men don't want to, or because we feel that we have to make ourselves indispensable. And due to EDI initiatives, I think as many of us will know, we're often called on to sit on job panels to make up the gender balance, much more than men are, add in obviously race or disability, and the burden is so much greater. So we have less time because we're doing stuff like that, which is super important, but has a, there is a trade-off there. I also see male colleagues praised for going above and beyond, and this is more anecdotal evidence, but last year I was a fixed-term lecturer at the University of Manchester. Everything was being done online from a distance from my home in London. Pastoral care was very, very important. Very little freaks me out. I have been in a psychiatric hospital in my past, so I'm happy to do that pastoral care, and I'm very good at it. But, I found that that was just seen as part of what I do, putting on extra office hours, going above and beyond at weekends, even if there were students who were freaking out. And ultimately, you don't see, men would be praised above and beyond, I think, for doing that. So that's kind of the sort of academic situation in HE. We also support, as I say, professional services staff. Now, professional services, so HR professionals, IT, libraries, educational, those kinds of roles. And what we find is that they are much more stable in terms of workload, in terms of holidays, in terms of work-life balance. A lot of academics or people who've done academic degrees and maybe spend some time casualised end up moving into professional services roles. And we see this a lot because people would like to keep an institutional affiliation, but they cannot cope with precarity and spiralling workloads. And we find that more women move into these professional services roles from academia, or, for several reasons, but an obvious one being wanting to have children. And there's less of a career progression path within professional services. In an academic role, you're kind of lecturer, senior lecturer, reader, professor. There's less of this within PS, so wages quite stagnated at those levels. So these are all kind of very complex problems. Our institutions across HE are very different. You've got big Russell groups, you've got the Oxbridge model, which is different, and then you've got post-92s where things are very different. So TLDR, it is complicated, right? But what I think is great about this toolkit is that, it can be adapted to different workplaces. That the principles there are very kind of universally adaptable. Now, thinking through then to the situation in FE, which is something I'm a lot less qualified to comment on from a personal situation. I'm going to put a little report here in the chat. That is a report produced by the Education Trust. Now, in FE, what we see is colleges run by both private providers who have, there'll be like Novus Prisons Group who run different educational services among prisons. So we have private providing colleges, we have local authorities who provide other education. We have, and so we have a real variety, right? We have FE providers who are very rich and some who are really struggling financially. So there's a complete it's completely diverse sector. But we also, we do get some data from FE, but we don't get it in the way that we do for higher education. But this report, I think, is really helpful. Now, women make up 62% of the workforce in FE, so that's obviously a very big proportion, nearly 2/3. And I think some key takeaway points from this report is that men remain heavily overrepresented among trade roles, right? Trade support staff. So women being overrepresented in admin and caring support staff roles, which may not be surprising. And I think what you find is that within the trade support staff, it really depends there's a very big difference between whether you're, say, a mechanic or a hairdresser. And that can tend to be based on your gender, as to whether you are typically a mechanic or typically a hairdresser, and how what premium there is on your employment, and how much how much rarer it is to find someone who would teach mechanics, say, than hairdressing. So there's also this new requirement within FE to provide GCSE maths and English resits. Now, big premium on people who are prepared to teach this. Men tend to be, so wages are higher, men tend to be more mobile, right? Tend to be due to lack of caring responsibilities in general. And so they're more mobile in terms of moving location to work, so they get paid more, etc. So that's a little overview of the situation. I think I'll just want to kind of say, what they said, what the others said about the toolkit, it's great, it's empowering, and that's what we need. It's not about what your union officials or what your union headquarters can do for you. It's about what you can do for yourself with your colleagues in your workplace. And as I say, the great thing is that it is adaptable for future work on protected characteristics in the workplace. So thanks very much for listening, and I'll happy to take any questions.
That's wonderful, Jo. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. There's been so many things that have kind of been talked about today that are so kind of interrelated. The casualization that you've spoken about previously, the kind of real terms cuts to like public sector pay, integrated with, the gender pay gap that we kind of see in so many things, the intersectionality that interplays with that, the equal pay issues that we have, kind of in some sectors where I was talking with a colleague before about, when I was teaching in a school, a colleague of mine said, well, of course I didn't get my increase last year. I was on maternity leave. So, obviously, I didn't deserve it because I wasn't here. And that kind of thinking about that kind of wrong-headed thinking about that kind of thing is okay. We've got so many things kind of in the mix about this kind of issue, and I'm really hoping that that some people now are going to have some questions to put to our panelists here, either in the chat or something like that, because we're not going to get this opportunity again to have such great people in a room. So I really hope that some people have got some questions. Claire, I can see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it's not a question, it's just an observation, really. I mean, just looking around the room and looking at the participants who've come tonight, there's no men here, and we really need to be getting this message out to our male members as well. We all need to be fighting this together. It shouldn't just be being led and spearheaded by women. We need to make our male counterparts aware that, this is an issue for us colleagues. We need to be working together. And I think that if we're going to do anything and to get any proper traction behind it, we need to be working together regardless of whether we're male or female. It needs to be a profession forging forward to make sure that everybody is being treated equally.
Yes, no, thank you, Claire. I know that we have male allies, I know that we have men who kind of understand the problem and, and kind of really agree with it, but it's kind of encouraging them to kind of stand alongside us and use their voice as well, to be able to say this shouldn't just be down to women to kind of flag this up. This should be something that we all speak about because it affects all of us. And, as men, we use our voice as well, right? Thank you. Anybody else? I have got some questions that were kind of submitted at the launch event that we have previously, which I think would be pertinent. I'd rather hear from people who are on this call, so please do put some things in the chat while I'm talking. One of the questions I've had, please do think about if you'd like to answer it. So what tactics would you suggest using if an employer will not supply the answers to our questions, either under the right for information for collective bargaining purposes, because I know that lots of unions, for example, are recognised. What do I do if an employer just kind of won't engage with me? It's kind of as a key question. Does anybody want to answer that? Claire?
I'll take that one. I always like to have fun conversations with employers around things like this. It is about the collective. It's about collectivizing, isn't it? If we have made that request, which we're entitled to do, to get that information, of freedom of information, or however else they would like to do it, if we have made what is a reasonable request and that has been denied by an employer, then it's down to the members You know, make the members aware of the fact that their employer is not responding to something that is a completely reasonable request, and what do the members want to do about it. Now, I'm not saying we're all going to be on a picket line and all waving our flags, but ultimately we could be, because it's that strength in numbers, isn't it? You know, and if an entire membership within a school is saying, look, we just want this information, why can't we have this information? Then we've got to use the powers that we have as trade unions in order to force the hand. And whether that sounds extreme or not, well, we wouldn't have to take any kind of action if a reasonable request was being met, would we? You know, and quite often it's not going to get to strike action. It might get to, you know, just the threat of, look, because of the position you're putting us in, by not giving us the information that we're requesting, this is potentially going to be the next step. And employers don't necessarily understand that their actions can have consequences which they won't like. But yeah, it's about collectivizing. It's about getting the members behind the message, to show them that it's not just these nasty unions that are asking for this. It's the members, it's their staff that want that information.
That's great. Thank you, Claire. Joe, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is helpful, and bear in mind that I don't work at UCU head office, right? So I'm just going on what I've heard from staff. But that FE report that I posted, we don't automatically get that info for FE, but UCU basically started basically saying to FE colleges, send us this info or we will FOI you. And that doesn't work for everybody because there are some private providers, but I'm wondering if that's you know, one way to do it. But yeah, I think there are employers who are intransigent in terms of giving out this information. And I think possibly you could say, well, why? You know, if there's no huge problems here, why are you so recalcitrant in giving us this info? And I get that it's possibly different in schools because, and in FE colleges to an extent, because in HE, although it is happening less and less, you know, I think we've possibly got a bit more freedom to speak out about stuff. But I think, you know, reputational damage. Why are our employers so incalcitrant? But I don't know how it works if you're a teacher and whether there can be, you know, pushback. So I just thought I'd mention that.
No, that's really good. Thank you, Joe. Really good point about the FOIs. Kate.
I think I just echo what's been said, really. I suppose the other thing is you can slowly up the ante and tighten the noose. As Claire says, you don't have to sort of threaten walk out on day one. You can make these very reasonable requests. We'd always say, be formal, put them in writing, be very polite. You're just information gathering to understand if there is an issue. If they won't tell you, why won't they tell you? Is there an issue? And slowly tighten the noose on them, because it is very difficult for an employer to resist a reasonable request in relation to this from a large number of people, which goes to Claire's point. If you collectivise and let's say your local authority and 500 staff come and ask at the local authority, essentially, when you've got that collectivised approach, that's difficult to turn down because your staff have a concern, a legitimate concern that you as an employer should be addressing. So there's lots of things that can be done before any big button is pressed if that puts people off. And I think I would just say, let's not forget it's a really reasonable request. What is there to hide? We're just asking for data. That's all it is, pure and simple. So I think I'd support both Joe and Claire, and I think we all probably are on the same page on that one.
No, that's really good, Kate. Thank you very much. I want to finish on time, but I've seen a question in the chat and I've got very excited about it. So I'm going to ask, Laura said, how can we stop schools from routinely demoting women with TLRs who want to go part-time? Excellent question. Anybody care to answer that?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it again, because it's pretty much the same answer as I just gave to the other question. It is about collectivizing. You know, if there is, it's about seeing whether a pattern has been established, whether women are having their TLRs removed because they've gone part-time or whatever. If a school has got a mindset that this is the way it works, somebody can't be part-time and hold a TLR, then they need to be told the truth about that. And the only way we can do that half the time is, again, by getting members together. And if it has happened to one woman member, one female member who has had their TLR denied because they've wanted to go part-time, then it's going to have happened to another. And if it's not happened already, then it will do in the future. So for us in the NASUWT, it had been literally me going into a school to speak to the membership to say, look, do you know that this has happened? Has this happened to any more of you? And getting face to face with that employer and basically asking them what they're playing at, you know, telling them about the error of their ways. You cannot do this. It's discriminatory. And there are processes which we will have to follow unless this is rectified. It's all about collectivism. It's all about engaging the members. You know, if we want anything in any job, then, you know, our workplaces need to be unionised.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you. Okay, Kate, I'm going to take you 30 seconds because then I'm going to close. But please give us the benefit of your wisdom in 30 seconds.
I would absolutely agree with Claire. I would say on that one, because employers have to be very careful about what they do with part-time workers. You may also want to individually contact your union on that one to see what can be done on an individual basis, as well as a collective basis, because employers sometimes get that very badly wrong and find themselves in a very difficult position. So just to add that one into the mix there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And on that note, we're going to end. I just want to take this opportunity to very much thank all the speakers and say it was wonderful to see you all. Thank you so much for all the delegates for coming and to all the speakers for speaking. We did put in our chat if you'd like to keep in touch with the Equality Trust, we've got a newsletter that you can sign up to. But thank you so much for coming, everybody. It was really appreciated. I hope you felt that it was really useful today. Do use the toolkit. It is going to be available for a long time, and it is going to have a launch as a website in September as well. So use that as a starting point for some of the discussions with your work colleagues and with your employers. So thank you so much.